Hello everyone, welcome to the 24th lecture of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development. As you know, we are going to complete the 10th week of this course, Critics of Dependency Theory. In the last class, what we have discussed the critics of the dependency theory from the vantage point of the neoclassical reaction as well as the Marxist critique of dependency theory in the context of the debates between development on the one hand and underdevelopment on the other. Okay? If you look at this, we have already discussed the neoclassical reaction and also we have discussed development versus underdevelopment, the Marxist critique. Today what we are going to do, we are going to complete this portion, especially the debate amongst the dependists, the proponents of dependency theory at the crossroads. If you look at this at the crossroads, the debate among the dependists, the military coup in Chile in September 1973 constituted a turning point in the Latin American debate on underdevelopment as well as dependence. Until then, the dependency school had a fair wind, mainly because of the rise of a number of popular regimes in Latin America during the 1960s and the 1970s. These regimes, that is Argentina, Bolivia, Chile and Peru, were greatly influenced by the dependency school's arguments, which was particularly obvious in Peru as well as Chile. The enemy was often identified with US imperialism, resulting in a number of nationalizations and other measures directed against foreign capital, foreign investment and so on. With a slight exaggeration, it might be said that there was as many dependency theories as there were dependency theorists. A multiplicity which was already present in Chile. A debate among the dependists was therefore only to be expected, but this debate was certainly kept in a positive vein. As you have already mentioned, the Latin American critique of Andre Gunder Frank, his much too mechanical interpretation of dependence was rejected, and of course Frank answered them back. If you look at, for example, Bambira's works on capitalist development in Latin America, which is also a representative of the positive critique of that period. If you look at the works of Bambira, who worked together with Dos Santos, evaluated Cardoso's as well as Faleto's analysis of development as one of the most relevant analysis. The relatively kind critique that followed dealt with three problems which were closely associated with the author's much too sociological view. What are those three problems? First, the method adopted. The economic aspect was included only as a loosely defined structure upon which the authors had built a mainly sociological analysis. The economic factor was thus of importance only to the definition of the structural parameters. The study then went on to analyze the behavior of various social groups from a sociological point of view. Bambira claimed that the behavior of social groups and classes must be derived from their objective economic interests and from the way in which these objective economic interests change with time. Thus, the economic factor will appear to be static when the economic and the sociological analysis are not performed concurrently. When you look at the way in which The second one, the way in which the development of various Latin American socioeconomic structures was analyzed, you will find that Cardoso and Faleto did not provide a thorough discussion about the structural changes in Latin America from the mid 19th century onwards. They ought to have provided an analysis of how structural changes in the developed advanced capitalist countries also led to changes in the dependent countries. And the third problem that we are discussing, that the classification of countries. As a result of this such classification, Bambira felt that the author's way of classifying the countries in the study was inappropriate. Two types of countries had been used for the historical analysis: those which had managed to gain national control of the process of production, and enclave economies. Accordingly, both Mexico as well as Chile were characterized as enclave economies, which in Bambira's opinion was unrealistic, as both countries belonged somewhere between the two prototypes. Despite important exceptions such as Cardoso, the prevailing view among the development theorists in Chile during this period was that a theory of dependence could be constructed, and that the work on this had only just begun. The critique, therefore, in reality was constructive and positive. Nevertheless, there were some critical voices objecting to the project of constructing a theory of dependence. We have, in the last lecture, we have discussed Laclau's reflections on the importance of the term called dependence. The dependency school was also criticized by a number of structuralists who, based on empirical studies, found a number of flaws in its underdevelopment perspective. The ECLA economists, for example, Aníbal Pinto and Jan Nackel, demonstrated that although a polarization between the center and the periphery had in fact taken place during the 1960s, it was not primarily the result of structural links between the two regions. Such polarization was caused by an exceptionally rapid growth in the center, which could be explained by the internal factors in that region. What Pinto and Nackel said, that it seems necessary to recall that colonial and neo-colonial extractions constitute a subordinate aspect of the center's dynamization in that period, although they might have been significant for certain peripheral countries. The best evidence for this, which contradicts known arguments, may be found in the extraordinary development of those center areas lacking colonial basis. The dependency theorists were also proved wrong in certain more narrowly defined areas, one of which was the effects of technological dependence. Technological dependence was generally considered to be a crucial element in the overall dependence. Dependency theorists claimed what they, among other things, what dependency theorists claimed, they claimed that since those who controlled the generation of technology, that is the center, that is the most advanced capitalist nations, also have the capacity to control its exploitation. Okay, that would lead to the permanence of technological dependency. The possibilities for a generation of domestic technology was therefore excluded. Empirical studies in Latin America found, however, that this was not the case, particularly in the semi-industrialized countries. For example, Argentina, being a representative of this type of country, had during the 1970s shown a relatively rapid development of domestic technology. Successive adaptations to local conditions of imported technology had resulted in new technological assets that were markedly different from those imported and with commercial value of their own. This type of export was generally by domestic firms, and it was limited to other Latin American countries. That is, I mean, I am referring to the countries with a number of structural similarities. The same kind of, the same kind of development was also underway in Mexico, a fact that has been corroborated by a study of the industries in the Monterrey area. And this and what what Fairchild once said, not only are established Mexican firms in a broad range of industries performing comparably with foreign firms in terms of profitability, growth and exports, but they appear to be at least innovative in the sense of introducing new products and productive processes. Perhaps even more important, more importantly, they appear to be relying substantially on domestic and domestic institutions, and particularly resources internal to the firm to generate the new technology, and to say the least, a national industrial base not subordinated to foreign competition appears to be alive and well and living in Montreal. The emergence of technology generation by indigenous enterprises in underdeveloped countries raised new questions concerning the role of technology imports in general and of direct investment of multinational corporations in particular. Since these firms are most important actors in the generation, application and international transfer of modern technology. In the dependency literature, the dynamic aspects of technology as well as the possible spillover effects of foreign investment were totally ignored. Evidence from the Mexican manufacturing industry showed, however, that foreign investment could give rise to indirect gains or spillovers to the host economy through the realization of external economies. Regarding the most important sources of spillover efficiency, another study by Blomstrom suggests that foreign entry promotes greater efficiency in Mexican firms by increasing competition. In that way, foreign firms force domestically owned ones to adopt more efficient methods of production. After the military takeover in Chile, what we generally find that Mexico City subsequently assumed the role as Latin America's new theoretical center. As such, it received a number of prominent development theorists who had been forced to leave Chile. However, it might be appropriate to give a short description of Mexico's unique position in Latin America before Latin America, and Mexico is in many ways different from the rest of Latin America. Apart from being a big country with a relatively developed economy, it is also politically more stable. Also, the Mexican culture in many respects is unique and quite different from that of the other Latin American countries. The Mexican identity is asserted at many levels, maybe art, music, literature and so on. It is particularly interesting to note that the Marxist tradition in Mexico again is different. It is quite obvious that so-called neo-Marxism has had relatively little effect upon the Mexican Marxists, and that the more traditional type of Marxism has prevailed. Compared to Chile, for example, where neo-Marxism had a greater influence in the universities, Mexican Marxism was far less visionary, with a greater tendency towards determinism. Although an analysis of the reasons for this difference is beyond the scope of this lecture, of course. But what I intend to do here is that one important reason might be the influence on Mexican intellectual life of the exiled Spanish opponents of the Franco regime. Thus, it is no mere coincidence that the ideas of the dependency school were developed in the southern parts of the Latin American continent, or that they ran into stiff opposition in Mexico. I mean, we have already discussed that some Mexican social scientists, namely Stavenhagen and others, did not join the dependency school because of their Mexican roots, although they started out along similar lines. In addition to the concrete political setbacks which the dependency school had suffered, first in Chile in 1973 and later across the entire southern part of the continent, it now also faced a completely different Marxist tradition. The ensuing debate not only influenced the dependency theorists' views, but also revitalized the Marxist debate in Mexico. Agustin Cueva, for example, provided an important contribution to the Marxist critique of further elaborating on that of Laclau. His writings, Agustin Cueva's writings, contain only a few references to the Marxist critique in Europe, although it is basically similar. This is quite natural, since Marx's method is now being used to answer the questions originally posed by the proponents of dependency theory. The dependency school's response was offhand. The critique was dismissed by a simple reference to the fact that the critics had neither understood the dependency theory nor provided any viable alternatives. What Bambira, the way Bambira replied to Cueva, it is difficult to follow Cueva's line of argument, since he starts with Andre Gunder Frank, jumps to Dos Santos, returns to Frank, continues on to Cardoso and Faleto, then to Marini, Frank again, Cardoso and Faleto again, Frank, Marini, Frank. That's how, Dos Santos used similar arguments, and on top of it all, he did not even consider it justified. Bambira did not even consider it justified to respond to the critique. Cueva also, since the critics were not at all versed in the dependency theory. Thus, his reply consisted of restatement of his idea of dependency theory. Bambira's reply to Marxist critique also contained references to Marini's writings on peripheral capitalism, capitalism as being pursued or practiced in the less developed countries. In her opinion, what Bambira said, they were an elaboration on the Marxist theory, a fact that of which the critics quite obviously had missed. To be a Marxist is to create, not just to repeat texts. It is important to know how to use the dialectic method when analyzing a concrete situation. That's what Bambira wrote. What she further noted, Bambira, that it should be obvious that Marini's theoretical constructs about peripheral capitalism and orthodox Marxian tradition are in many ways incompatible. It is all very well that the dependency theorists have filled pages with class analysis, but using these in the theories is an entirely different matter. One of Cardoso's articles contained in 1976, which contained an interesting contribution to the Latin American dependency debate. In that article, what Cardoso how Cardoso shows that the dependencies were never a homogeneous group. Using the same method that Stavenhagen had used in 1966 to criticize the traditional theory of development, and Cardoso now criticized dependency theory. In other words, Cardoso constructed a number of fallacies and then proceeded to analyze them. What are those fallacies? One, capitalist development at the periphery is not viable. Certain structural obstacles as well as lack of dynamic capital prevent the development of an entirely capitalist system. In Cardoso's opinion, it is wrong to claim that this must be so. That is, that this is the result of the workings of some natural law, and contradictions do not stand in the way of capitalist development, but constitute a natural part of it. Secondly, dependent capitalism is based on extensive exploitation of labor and is tied to the necessity of underpaying labor. In other words, this notion points out the problem of limited and stagnant domestic markets, which in turn is an important factor in the explanation of sub-imperialism. Okay, we have discussed sub-imperialism in the last lecture. If you slightly recall, we have already discussed sub-imperialism. Okay. Thirdly, staying on with the second one, okay, such view is much too mechanical and ignores the dynamic aspects of even peripheral capitalism. Thirdly, local bourgeois no longer exist as an active social force. The proponents of this view claim that the local bourgeois in the periphery is parasitic, lumpen bourgeois. It is neither capable of achieving a normal rational accumulation of capital, nor is it able to realize its own true interests. Okay? For example, look at the works of Andre Gunder Frank, the world metropolis model. Such view, still quoting Cardoso, confuses the unsuccessful ideology of national populism and the true interests of the local industrial bourgeois. Fourthly, the penetration of multinational firms leads local states to pursue an expansionist policy, typically sub-imperialist policy. Like the rest of these arguments, this one exaggerates the local capitalists' incompetence. It is incorrect to say that the increase in export activity has favored only the multinational corporations. And finally, what Cardoso tries to look at, that the periphery's only alternatives are socialism or fascism. The ruling classes in Latin America have undoubtedly become increasingly militarized, but that doesn't simply imply a fascist political organization. Thus, Cardoso dismissed all of these, that capitalist development at the periphery is not viable, dependent capitalism is based on extensive exploitation of labor and is tied to the necessity of underpaying labor. Local bourgeois no longer exist as an active social force. The penetration of multinational firms leads local states to pursue an expansionist policy, typically sub-imperialist policy. And finally, the periphery's only alternatives are socialism or fascism. All these arguments Cardoso tried to dismiss by claiming that they were created merely to support each other. Okay, this is important. How Cardoso tried to reflect on this, on such dismissal or some kind of rejection of these arguments. He wrote that theoretical and analytical efforts to show what is specific and new in the current forms of dependency seem to have dissipated into images full of easy but misleading abstractions. Development and underdevelopment, sub-imperialism, lumpen bourgeois, revolutions of the marginals, and so on. Although such ideas sometimes point to important aspects of the specificity of the industrialization process at the periphery and to the forms of domination which accompany it, they also lead to distorted analysis. Marini, for example, answered this critique by accusing Cardoso of sociologism. Here Marini defined his thesis that dependent capitalism was in essence different from capitalism in the advanced countries. Therefore, the basis for a dependency theory was still there, and Marini's opinion is, however, an exception in Latin America today. Although many of the questions raised by the dependency theorists have played and will certainly play an important role in the Latin American debate on underdevelopment as well as in the rest of the world, okay, even if it is Africa or Asia or so. Only a few today would answer these with a dependency theory. Before moving on to the next phase of this course, I would like to draw your attention to the Asian context, Indian perspectives so far as dependency theory is concerned. please don't think that dependency theory, obviously as it emerged in the context of Latin American debate on underdevelopment, it also had significant implications for Caribbean approaches in underdevelopment, or African approaches in underdevelopment, and obviously in the context of Asia, and India is no exception to this. The idea of dependence in the Asian context, if you look at this, okay, in what we have discussed in the context of the political economy of growth by Paul Barron and his concept of economic surplus, his concept of the distinction between actual surplus on the one hand and potential surplus on the other, it is Asia rather than Latin America that plays the leading role in the analysis of how the utilization of surplus leads to development in the center and to underdevelopment in the periphery. The conspicuous case of underdevelopment is India, whereas Japan provides proof of the fact that the ability to avoid colonial exploitation was the most important prerequisite for an indigenous capitalist development process. On this, what Barron says, that indeed there can be no doubt that had the amount of economic surplus that Britain has torn from India been invested in India, India's economic development to date would have borne little similarity to the actual somber record. It is idle to speculate that whether India by now would have reached a level of economic advancement commensurate with its fabulous natural resources and with the potentialities of its people. In any case, the fate of the successive Indian generations would not have resembled even remotely the chronic catastrophe of the last 2 centuries. Apart from transferring a substantial economic surplus from India, the British actively underdeveloped India. That is what Barron suggested very rightly. Thus, the British administration of India systematically destroyed all the fibers and foundations of Indian society. Its land and taxation policy ruined India's village economy and substituted for its the parasitic landowner and moneylender. Its commercial policy destroyed the Indian artisan and created the infamous slums of the Indian cities filled with millions of starving and diseased paupers. Its economic policy broke down whatever beginnings there were of an indigenous industrial development and promoted the proliferations of speculators, petty businessmen, agents and serfs of all descriptions, eking out a sterile and precarious livelihood in the messes of a decaying society. And on this basis, one would have expected that India rather than Latin America had been the center of a debate on dependence. It was not, at least not of the kind of debate we know from Latin America by now. Nevertheless, there was in fact during the later part of the 19th century a contribution reminiscent of the Latin American discussion during its early stages. What Blomstrom and Hetney did here, they were trying to refer to Dadabhai Naroji's drain theory. Okay, this is extremely important. What is that drain theory? The drain theory should be seen as an integral part of the coming of age of the Indian national consciousness during the later part of the 19th century. That is what Bipan Chandra argued once. It was argued that England exacted an annual tribute of enormous proportions. The empirical estimations have shown different results, but the actual size of it is less important in this context. The drain was exercised not only in British India but also in the princely states, of which Mysore bore a particularly heavy burden. The critics of the drain claimed that this transfer of capital deprived India of development opportunities in the form of infrastructure, investments, education and so on, and the similarity with Barron's surplus theory is striking, and it is not surprising that he refers to this 19th century debate which so much centered on the problem of drain rather than to more recent historical accounts. It is almost as if this early Indian dependency debate via Paul Baron has influenced the Latin American debate. In the current development debate, dependence is a rather marginal phenomenon. Dadabhai Naoroji, the central figure in the Indian drain debate, worked mostly in London. His most important work was Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, published in England in 1901. The drain issue was first thought of or brought up in 1866. A tentative version of his theory was completed by the following year in 1867. Indian economists have pointed out the similarity between Naoroji's drain theory and the considerably younger Prebisch-Singer thesis. Nevertheless, such similarity is far from perfect. The exploitation of India was due to its subordinate position in the British Empire, not the forces of the free market. And Dadabhai Naoroji was a good liberal and admirer of the British way of life. The problem, as he saw it, was that the British rule in India was un-British. A true liberal policy which did not favor India at Britain's expense would, in accordance with the then current economic ideas, permit India to develop economically. Hitherto, what Dadabhai Naoroji wrote in Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, that hitherto England has to some extent made herself rich by plundering India in diverse subtle and ingenious ways. But what Naoroji desired and maintained was that England could become far richer by dealing justly and honorably with India, and thereby England would not only be a blessing to India and itself, but will be a lesson and a blessing to mankind. However, Dadabhai Naoroji did not advance a theory of dependence as we know it from Latin American continent. His analysis was mainly concerned with the devastating effects on the Indian economy of a unilateral and unjust economic relation. It never crossed Naoroji's mind that free trade might also carry with it some disadvantages as a result of the nature of the exchange and structural conditions in the two countries. It is therefore hardly correct to see Naoroji as an Indian Prebisch. However, it is correct to say that he laid the foundations of economic nationalism. The Swadeshi movement of 1905 was a reflection of this sentiment. The movement's objective was to stimulate Indian production by campaigns for domestically produced goods. Swadeshi was the first expression of an Indian strategy for self-reliance, and the concept later became one of the cornerstones cornerstones in Gandhi's philosophy. Swadeshi, self-reliance, Swaraj, and so on. Gandhi himself defines Swadeshi like this. After much thinking, how Gandhi had arrived at a definition of Swadeshi that perhaps best illustrated his meaning. Swadeshi is the spirit in us which restricts us to the use and service of our immediate surroundings to the exclusion of the more remote. Thus, as for religion, I must restrict myself to my ancestral religion, that is, the use of my immediate religious surrounding. If I find it defective, I should serve it by purging it of the indigenous institutions and serve them by curing them of their proved defects. In that of economics, I should use only the things that are produced by my immediate neighbors and serve those industries by making them efficient and complete where they might be found wanting. Thus, to Gandhi, Swadeshi was a comprehensive restoration of Indian society and culture, the development of which had been hampered and distorted by the ties with Great Britain. Dependence as a general idea and the strategy of self-reliance as its natural opposite are therefore basic understandings of the Indian politicians and intellectuals, particularly those holding Gandhian views. Gandhi's ideas on economic development were not derived exclusively or perhaps in this case not even primarily from the Hindu tradition. He was in fact heavily influenced by the Western, especially Russian populist tradition. Like the economics of populism, Gandhian economic thought can only be understood as a counter theory to Western economics. I mean, counter theory to imperialism. Okay. From Tolstoy, Gandhi borrowed the concepts of egalitarianism, simplicity and asceticism. From Ruskin, the emphasis on ethics in economic development. From Kropotkin, hatred of economic centralization and bureaucracy. Thus, the ideal for Gandhi was the rural economy. He visualized the society as being built up of circles of self-supporting and self-contained units exchanging only necessary commodities with other villages where they were not locally producible. Agriculture and handicraft based strictly on subsistence in place of an economy of surplus would be the foundations for Gandhi. It is extremely important. Land should be communal property and the implements and tools of a cottage industry should belong to the family traditionally engaged in it. Since in this society owners of the means of production would also be laborers, exploitation based on individual property would be impossible. Thus, Gandhi's way out of dependence on the West was basically the reinforcement of Indian tradition, a solution that from a Marxist point of view was the opposite to progress. On the eve of India's independence in 1947, the problem of planning had already been discussed for many years. The issue was what kind of planning and planning for whom. The power structure of India was very complex since the liberation movement had, for various reasons, kept together highly diverse segments of Indian society. Some years before independence, 3 different plans were produced representing different economic and social interests. For example, the Bombay plan was sponsored by leading industrialists and favored a kind of state capitalist system in which the activities of the state should make it easier for big business to prosper and grow. The People's Plan, secondly, emanated from labor organizations and advocated comprehensive state planning with the aim of socialism inspired by the Soviet model of development. And thirdly, the Gandhian plan was put together by pupils of Gandhi, the followers of Gandhi, and his emphasis on rural development and the building of a society based on Indian values, which played a prominent role in this plan. These, the Bombay plan, the People's Plan and the Gandhian plan. These various interests were related to particular segments of the Indian power structure and have constituted 3 different societal forces that may be called capitalism, socialism and Gandhism respectively. Okay, the Bombay plan represented capitalism, the People's Plan represented socialism and the Gandhian plan represented Gandhism. On the whole, Indian development has been influenced by the first 2, maybe capitalism or mostly capitalism and perhaps socialism and Gandhism have played a more ritual role. For example, the JP movement, the Janata Party, that Gyan Prakash Narayan, Janata Party movement, which started in early 1900 and Jai Prakash Narayan's movement, which started in early 1974 in Bihar, provided the first serious challenge that the Congress regime had faced since independence. It represented, among other things, a resurgence of Gandhian political activism after more than 25 years of passivity. Such passivity was caused by the particular interpretation of Gandhism made by Vinoba Bhave, but in the early 1970s, Many Sarvodaites, led by Jayaprakash Narayan, challenged Vinoba Bhave's views. The constructive approach was not sufficient. Political struggle was also necessary. The Sarvodaya organization was, however, too weak, except perhaps in Bihar, to carry out JP's total revolution, and therefore JP made use of the organized political opposition to attain the necessary infrastructure. The Gandhian element in the JP movement became more and more diluted as the movement was elevated from its original Bihar context and transformed into an all India movement. In spite of this, the political establishment was alarmed, and on the 26th of June 1975, the President of India declared a state of national emergency due to internal disturbances. The 1977 election destroyed the Indian dominant party, which in itself was a most remarkable outcome. A new party emerged to take over government responsibility, and this organization, the Janata Party, was a most unusual and peculiar political configuration, and the most unbelievable thing about it was perhaps that a Gandhian economic program was announced by the new government. And such election manifesto had spoken out against elitism, consumerism and urbanism. Light industry was preferred to heavy industry and rural to urban. It was furthermore necessary to steer away from both capitalism as well as socialism and strive for self-reliance. Nevertheless, after the election, the Janata government's economic declarations turned out to be much more vague. The bold program of self-reliance incontrovertibly implied a fundamental change in the development strategy. In other words, the heavy odds against its implementation stemmed not only from the lack of unity within the government, but also from various structural constraints. It is obvious that the Gandhian image of the Janata government to a very large extent was a concession to the role played by Janata Party, even Jayaprakash Narayan, in the struggle against the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. Even if the government had wanted to implement a Gandhian economic program, it was too paralyzed by internal conflicts to accomplish much. In the midst of this unprecedented political disintegration, Jayaprakash Narayan passed away, physically broken by his term in prison during the emergency and psychologically broken by disillusionment from watching the performance of what had been mainly his creation, the Janata Party. Was that the end of a self-reliant and indigenous approach to India's economic and social ills? What Blumstorm and Hetney here refer to, that it's important to look at M.N. Roy and Indian Marxism. Indian dependence has, however, been subjected to a Marxist analysis. As we have already discussed Marx's views on the non-European world, ascetic mode of production and so on, and also stressed that he was particularly interested in India as well as China, which he analyzed in terms of a particular ascetic mode of production. We also have discussed that this mode of production was denied its own dynamics, which in a sense legitimized colonialism on the basis of modern development. In relation to classical Marxism, or even more so in relation to the tactically determined diagnosis of the Communist International, Indian Marxists were more inclined to blame Indian underdevelopment on imperialism and capitalism. Like Dadabhai Naroji, the Indian Marxist M.N. Roy, for example, viewed India as a nation in chains with a distorted natural development. To Roy, the cause of colonial development, to M.N. Roy, the cause was colonial capitalism, as he called it. I mean, what is that colonial capitalism? The introduction of higher means of production in cotton manufacture marked an era of social and economic progress in England, but it had a retrograde effect upon India. The forces that helped to build so many industrial centers in the former were used for the destruction of prosperous towns and urban industrial centers in the latter. The reason of this diametrically opposite effect of the same course was that India as well as British society came under a more developed method of exploitation. But the improved means of production which made this new method of exploitation possible remained the property of the bourgeois of one country, which became the political ruler of the other. India had been subjected to capitalist exploitation without being allowed to reap the fruits of capitalist development. Roy's comment is very close to the neo-Marxist idea of the development of underdevelopment, as Bastian Wallenga pointed out. Thus, if Dadabhai Naoroji could be seen as an early Indian counterpart to Prebisch, then it is equally justified, what Blomstorm and Hetney argue, that it is equally justified to claim that M.N. Roy is Andergunder Frank's predecessor. It is of relatively minor importance that these analogies are far from perfect. What in this context is really interesting is that they are occasionally made by Indian intellectuals, and that the similarities indicate an awareness of the problem of dependency, which is at least as old as the Latin American one. The Latin American theory of dependency can hardly have been sensational to the Indian intellectuals, and therein lies the fact that the Indian critique was more negative than positive. If you look at the attitude towards dependency theory, both the notion of dependence as well as dependence as a historical experience have been clearly identifiable in the Indian intellectual and political debate for quite some time. Coming to Indian mode of production debate, okay, you can look at the works of Uchcha Patnaik, Ellis Turner, Daniel Turner on the mode of production debate in Indian agriculture and so on. The theoretical conflict between Locklear on the one hand and Andergunder Frank on the other. I mean, the key questions in the debate, the key question in the theoretical conflicts were, to what extent is it possible to claim that Indian agriculture is characterized by a capitalist mode of production? If it is not capitalist, how should it then be described in terms of modes of production? If it is capitalist, what then was the nature of the pre-capitalist mode of production? Can Indian agriculture and the Indian social formation as a whole be described as an articulation of several modes of production, and if so, which? Is there a specific mode of production neither capitalist nor semi-feudal in India? What Ellis Turner and others, Uchcha Patnaik and others, they have pointed out that this debate, which in theoretical richness and wealth of empirical data brought forward, can only be compared to the Latin American dependency debate, in fact covered many more issues, such as an identification of the principal rural classes, the main contradictions in rural India, peasant movements, and implications regarding political strategy for the left parties. Uchcha Patnaik argued that the debate about the capitalist nature of Indian agriculture began at the empirical level, and its purpose was primarily to identify the capitalist farmers. Eventually, it took up conceptual problems, I mean the criteria of capitalism, then methodological problems, I mean levels of analysis, and theoretical perspectives, I mean the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Okay, that's why it's important to concentrate upon the questions which are relevant to the dependency school and the critique of it. How Uchcha Patnaik analyzed the development of capitalism in Indian agriculture in several of her contributions, and objected to Frank's idea of the satellite automatically becoming capitalist as a result of imperialist penetration. Frank dismissed her conclusion, since it implies that Indian agriculture is feudal. To say that extended reproduction and accumulation is a criterion of capitalism is one thing, and to say that because the surplus is not invested in agriculture itself, or not in agriculture in the same geographical area, but is instead siphoned off for investment in industry, not to say industry in Great Britain, is another thing altogether. The fact that the British industrialized with the help of the drain, which was of course drained out of agriculture in India, in large part does not seem to be of useful proof. Okay, that's how Frank opposed Uchcha Patnaik. For example, Jairus Banaji, Hamza Alawi and others, they belonged to the group whose views were closer to those of the dependency school. Banerjee rejected the thesis of capitalism as well as the thesis of feudalism and tried to identify a mode of production that was peculiar to the colonial areas, a colonial mode of production, and in this way he avoided the artificial superimposing of European models on which they are not suited and where they confuse the issue. Hamza Alawi was closer to the Marxist terminology than to the dependency school, but he also emphasized the need for some kind of world system approach. Hamza Alawi's solution to the problem of using Marx's conceptual apparatus and its link to national economies without dropping world capitalism in the process was at the time, he has since reconsidered to work with a special mode of production, that is the colonial mode of production. He supported Laclou's argument that Frank's definition of capitalism was insufficient, but he nevertheless felt that the attacks on Frank, particularly those originating in India, paid scant attention to the theoretical problem raised by that author. Frank may not have solved the problem, but Laclou's idea of a feudal and a capitalist mode of production coexisting in the same economic system had not solved it either. The existence of two widely different modes of production within the same economic system would, from a Marxist point of view, inevitably mean that they were in contradiction with each other. But on the other hand, the Brazilian reality, like that of the countries of the third world, is that the feudal mode of production in agriculture is precisely at the service of imperialism rather than antagonistically in contradiction with it. Okay? And such approach, such varying debates on mode of production in Indian agriculture leads us to different take on self-reliance versus modernization, capitalist havens of Asia and so on. Turning to other parts of Asia, for example, the debate on dependency along Latin American lines is even more conspicuous by its absence than in India. Of course, China has been important for the strategy of self-reliance implied in Mao Zedong's ideas of development. Like Gandhi, Mao was deeply rooted in the soil of his country, but also in his case the Western impact seems to have had a catalyzing effect on his ideas. Mao is often pictured as a Marxist-Leninist, but it is of importance to point out that the influence of Marxism came rather late in his life. Like Gandhi, he was influenced by the anarchist and populist thinking of Kropotkin, Tolstoy, Bakunin and so on. In fact, the first great Chinese Marxist, Li Dazhao, who had a great impact on the young Mao, seems to have been equally influenced by Russian Narodism and Marxism. Even if he never directly referred to the Narodnik writings, he took a strikingly similar strand in emphasizing the village community and the need for the intellectuals to go to the people. His Marxism, like that of Mao, was therefore a very unorthodox kind. And towards modernization, when you look at this, in 1972, 73, then 74, 75 and so on, in the 70s and so on, the economic policies which were adopted, especially in China, were increasingly criticized. Then you will find the decisive victory over the Gang of Four, that in the context of China and so on. As far as the three contradictions that we tend to look at when we look at self-reliance versus modernization and so on, we tend to look at three contradictions. One is the contradiction between rural and urban, then agricultural versus and industrial, and then manual and intellectual. Okay, and these contradictions, when we look at these contradictions, we must understand the dialectical process that has obviously taken a turn in a socialist direction. Deurbanization was a major component in the Maoist model, for example, And it is likely that during the 1960s, China succeeded at least in keeping its cities from growing faster than the countryside. Okay? And more importantly, the prospects for these countries, I mean in the countries like for example Malaysia, Indonesia, I mean Asian countries, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, China, Japan of course is an exception. The prospects for these countries trying to emulate the newly industrialized countries are, at least for the moment, not very promising. On the one hand, this is due to the fact that several important conditions that have been crucial for the newly industrialized countries' success are absent in the emulators. One must also remember that the newly industrialized countries' phenomenon appeared in a favorable international context. Although, as Warren has rightly pointed out in 1980s, it is a myth that industrial production in the newly industrialized countries only takes place in free zones. One cannot ignore the fact that the success of the newly industrialized countries coincided with a changing international division of labor and favorable export possibilities. This underlines the fact that the newly industrialized countries' phenomenon may not be analyzed outside the context of the changing world economy. Okay? And in this sense, the dependency theory, or we try to foreground the critiques of dependency theory through the neoclassical reaction, through the Marxist critique on development versus underdevelopment, and at the crossroads, I mean the debate among the dependistas, and then we ended with the reflections so far as reflections of the Latin American debate on underdevelopment on the Asian context, with specific reference to Indian perspectives. We have come to the closer of the 10th week of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development, and in the 11th week we will start with the limits to growth thesis by Meadows and his colleagues. Thank you.